Good afternoon, or whatever time it is, wherever you are. I am Joel Whitehead, the Executive Vice President of the International Propeller Club, and I welcome you to our first webinar for 2026. For those of you who don't know the International Propeller Club, we are an international business network dedicated to promoting the maritime industry, commerce, and global trade. We have more than 65 chapters in ports around the world, including almost 30 in foreign cities, and we will celebrate our 100th anniversary in 2027. If you would like to join the International Propeller Club, please check us out at our website at www.propellerclubus.com. For those of you who are watching today, if you have any questions after our guest speaker has concluded his talk, please post your question in the chat. So now let me introduce you to the star of our webinar today. He is Dr. Salvatore Mercogliano, and he's an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina and is an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in marine transportation from the State University of New York Maritime College, along with a Merchant Marine Deck Officer license, unlimited tonnage second mate, and a master's in maritime history and nautical archaeology from East Carolina University, and a PhD in military and naval history from the University of Alabama. Dr. Sal publishes articles and commentaries in the U.S. Naval Institute's Proceedings and Naval History, as well as many other publications worldwide. He is the host of the very popular YouTube show, What's Going On with Shipping, which has nearly 600,000 subscribers and 138 million views. Please welcome a friend of the International Propeller Club and our friend, Dr. Sal Mercogliano.
Thank you, Joel. I appreciate that introduction. It was much more than you needed to do. But I appreciate the opportunity to come here today and to kick off your series this year in 2026 for the Propeller Club. So I'm excited. I was asked to talk about looking back at 2025 and then ahead, kind of a global shipping outlook for 2026. So real quick, just a little bit more on my background is I'm a former merchant mariner. I did sail, graduated SUNY Maritime College, sailed for about 4 years and then worked ashore for 4 years for the Military Sea Lift Command. Decided to swallow the anchor, went ashore, got my education, and I've been teaching ever since. But 5 years ago, back in March of 2021, I started a YouTube channel, What's Going On with Shipping. Initially, it was just a lark. It was I was asked to go on and give commentary about the Ever Given going sideways in the Suez, and myself and John Conrad over at G Captain decided to film a couple of episodes talking a little bit more in depth about Ever Given, and then Ever Given got unstuck, but then arrested, and I kept kind of following her. But then I had a viewer, I wish I knew who it was, comment one time, "Hey, there's other ships you can talk about." And so I did. I started talking about other ships, started talking about shipping around the world, provide a little bit of background on shipping, talked about the global supply chain crisis, and what went from 136 subscribers when I started, now it, as Joel said, almost 600,000 subscribers. And one of the things I will always say is they're not tuning in to look at my melon of a head. They're tuning in to because of their interest in global shipping. It is a topic that has a lot of resonance right now. It has a lot of attention, and I think that groups like the Propeller Club and many others are more essential than ever before in being able to get that information out to the public. But with that, I want to go ahead and kind of start my talk today and discuss specifically the issue here about global shipping and what it entails. Hopefully, my slides are showing and we're good to go. So here we go. So, real quick, see if I get my slide to change here. There we go. So I'm going to talk about 5 topics today. 5 topics that I think were of absolute essential back in 2025, and then talk about how they will play out here into 2026. So the first topic is got to be the trade war and all associated with that. Obviously, with Donald Trump coming back in as president, 47th president of the United States, what we see here was an initiation of a series of tariffs initiated by the president. And there was a lot of debate about that. I will say that early in this year, I did a lot of videos that talked specifically about the impact of those tariffs. Specifically, what was going to happen to U.S. trade? Were we going to see, for example, were the ports empty? Was there going to be desolation in American ports? I mean, we were talking and predicting a 33% drop in total imports into the United States. And while we did see a precipitous drop, particularly in May and June of 2025, what we did see was some other facts that kind of really got drowned out a bit. For example, there was a huge amount of front loading that went in prior to that drop. We had some exceptionally high months for March and April. We then saw some readjustments. We saw cargo shift where it's coming from. We saw a movement of goods coming not just from China, but from Vietnam, from Cambodia, from Thailand, from India, from the Philippines. A lot of other countries picked up that difference, and we saw cargo coming in. So that when we closed out 2025 and you look at the numbers, and again, one of the things that I like to do is when news items hit out there is really kind of peel that onion, look at the issue a little bit more, so that when the National Retail Federation, for example, comes out and says, well, we are expecting the last quarter of the year, we're going to be importing less than 2 million containers per month. When you look at the numbers, we're well over 2 million. Matter of fact, we went up in December. We were up over about almost 2.2 million containers in December. And when you compare 2025 to 2024, we're just down 0.04% in total container imports. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't massive disruptions. Doesn't mean that we haven't seen increased costs associated with the movement of goods, particularly with that warehousing. We haven't seen escalation in costs. So there is definite impact. But one of the things that I think was really, really important was to be able to put the trade war into a context. The other element that was talked about quite a bit was the port fees. The U.S. Trade Representative went out and was talking about the issue of port fees, whether or not we were going to level port fees against Chinese-owned, Chinese-built, Chinese-operated vessels. And the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative, put out a call for comments, and he got them. He got a large number of comments there. And what we saw was the threat of the trade representative's port fees led to a discussion between the president and Chairman Xi that has put the port fees on hold for a year. So we can basically expect to see a kind of holding off on that right now. What is 2026 have in prospect for us? I would argue that we're still going to see a pretty good year come up here. Now, is it going to be the same level we were at 2025 and 2024? Obviously, one of the big things we learned from 2024, and if you go back to 2020 and 2021, is that we see basically the cycle change. Where do we have our peaks and trough? 2025, we had that artificial dip in May and June, but then we had an extremely high rise back up later in the year in July and August. So we're definitely going to see what the numbers look like after the end here of Golden Week in China and East Asia. And do we see a big spring back? What we are watching very closely, particularly in the container trade right now, is whether or not we start seeing some scrapping of some of the tonnage that's out there as new tonnage is coming online. What we have not seen in the container trade is a lot of ships heading for the beach in Turkey, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. Will we see that? Because what we're watching right now is the growth of those container fleets across the board. Second topic has to do with shipbuilding. I mean, shipbuilding has been a primary focus in the United States and around the world. A new revitalization about U.S. shipbuilding. President Trump issued an executive order early this year. We had the reintroduction of the SHIPS Act by Senators Kelly and Young, bipartisan support for this SHIPS Act, which has a lot of potential to see U.S. shipbuilding take off in the United States if the measure is passed and if the incentives are there to have it done. What we have seen happen over the past 25 years is the rise of China as a shipbuilder. China was building roughly about 5% of the world's ships in 1999. This graph from BRS Shipbrokers talks about the fact that China is on track to have about 60 to 70% of the order book for the upcoming year in Chinese shipyards. We know they built 51% of the world's ships in 2024, probably going to come out as around 60% in 2025 once we get the numbers in. So shipbuilding is really important. And one of the things that's really happening with shipbuilding is the other two major shipbuilders in the world, Korea and Japan, are losing out. If you go from 2024 to 2020, 2025, or actually across the past 2 years, from 2022 to 2024, Japan and Korea have lost 16% of the global share of shipbuilding. China gained 16%. So Japan and Korea have a very vested interest in competing against China in shipbuilding. It's one of the reasons I think we saw Korea, particularly the Hanwha Shipping Company, invest in the Philadelphia shipyard and start talking about building MR tankers, potentially LNG carriers in the United States. And shipbuilding has been obviously in the forefront this past year. We've had issues with U.S. Navy shipbuilding, with the cancellation of the Constellation class, the shift over to the National Security Cutter, efforts to try to get U.S. shipbuilding up and going and try to revitalize the American merchant marine. Shipbuilding has a lot of attention. Obviously, there are issues associated with that. The SHIPS Act is kind of stalled right now in Congress. Obviously, there are issues between the president and Senator Mark Kelly that are creating some tension there. But more importantly, there is a lot of incentive to get it out. I testified before Congress at the end of last year regarding the SHIPS Act. We're waiting for the House to have similar hearings so that we can get a bill out of the House and then off to a conference committee and potentially, hopefully, a signing of the SHIPS Act. If we don't get the SHIPS Act this year, which is a potential possibility, I envision that portions of that SHIPS Act may be carved out and put into appropriations bills so that we see elements of the SHIPS Act get passed in a small bite-sized slice formation. Shipbuilding obviously has a lot of issues. It has broad bipartisan support because shipbuilding doesn't just happen in Democrat or Republican states. It happens across all states. It has endorsement in both the House and the Senate and over in the White House. In particularly, one of the things I've noted is the congressional staffs are very hot on this right now. Where there is some pushback on the shipbuilding in the United States, I would say, is some fear that commercial shipbuilding will take away from naval shipbuilding. You hear executives from Huntington Ingalls, from General Dynamics, very concerned that if we put more priority into commercial shipbuilding, that could potentially rob and steal from ship workers that are needed for naval shipbuilding. I disagree with that. I do not abide by that. I think if we can increase the labor base across the board in terms of job availability, we will get more workers into that sector. Obviously, there's elements that have to be fixed. We have to increase wages. We got to do more training. We've got to make the shipping industry more accessible and recognizable to younger people out there. And again, Propeller Club and many other organizations are very essential for getting that information out there. So I think shipbuilding has been really one of the big stories for 2025, not just in the United States, but globally. Third topic here has to be geopolitics. I mean, the amount of stuff happening around the world involving shipping on a daily basis is bread and butter for my channel. I don't know about anybody else, but it's hard for me to keep up literally with the lineage and just the amount of stuff that is happening out there and around the world. And I will take you around maritime choke points right now and talk about some of those issues. So, for example, we just had an announcement out from the Baltic states announcing that they're going to start cracking down on Russian shadow fleet vessels coming in and out of the Baltic. So, are we seeing a recreation of the old Hanseatic League in the Baltic with Germany, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Finland, all kind of making sure that they have issues? They've got a good reason to be concerned because over the past few years, we've seen many ships, for some strange reason, drag anchors across the bottom of the Baltic and sever cables and supply lines. We, of course, had the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline in the region. But just recently, we had the German Coast Guard turn around a ship coming into the Baltic because of the ship not meeting the requirements necessary, proper registry, proper insurance, proper classification. And so this issue with the dark fleet, I think, is one that's actually going to resonate throughout this section of the talk here quite a bit, because the dark fleet is a interesting development. The dark fleet is called the gray fleet, the shadow fleet, you name it. I like to refer to it as the parallel fleet because what we have done and what the United States, the G7, the EU have done is create and force out of the mainstream shipping fleet a batch of vessels, largely over 15 years of age, that are operating outside the bounds of international shipping. These sanctions are aimed against nations like Venezuela, Iran, and Russia, and particularly where this took off more than anywhere was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The G7 and the EU wanted to punish Russia for their invasion of Ukraine, but at the same time, they didn't want to disrupt the flow of oil coming out of Russia. So they instituted a price cap. $60 per barrel for crude oil, $100 per barrel for diesel. That has since dropped. It's in the low 40s now for diesel. That idea was to keep Russian oil flowing and diesel flowing, but not allow Russia to profit from it. And what Russia has done is break away and create this shadow fleet, dark fleet, ghost fleet, parallel fleet that's operating outside the bounds. They're using older ships. They're using flags of convenience, and I separate flags of convenience from open registries. They're not using Liberia, Marshall Islands, and Panama. They are using Gambia, Guyana, St. Kitts, Nevis, Palau, registries that basically are operating just for the money, and they're not doing the due diligence oversight necessary to ensure ships are meeting the standards required. Ships are operating without insurance. Some have critiqued saying, well, Russia is operating outside of the London insurance market. Well, that London insurance market, which we're going to talk about, provides a great deal of insurance so that when an accident happens, there's coverage. So now they're not using the 12 international P&I protection indemnity clubs that cover 90% of the global shipping. They're basically getting either no insurance, state-funded insurance, or fly-by-night insurance that is not providing the coverage necessary should these ships be involved in an accident. And then we're not getting classification where the ships are being undergoing inspections. They're not meeting the requirements of MARPOL, SOLAS. And what we have operating on the world's oceans now are fleets of extremely dangerous vessels that should there be an accident, there's going to be little coverage for it. We had an incident last year in 2025, back in, I think it was June or July, it was in the summertime, where Frontline had a collision with a ship in the Straits of Hormuz, coming out of the Straits of Hormuz. And the ship in question was a dark fleet tanker. And there was no way to properly identify the owner, insurance. Matter of fact, Frontline had to provide coverage for the crew of the other vessel. So we're definitely seeing this happen. The Red Sea, the Houthis. The Houthis made their appearance, attacking global shipping back at the end of 2023 when they staged their assault on Galaxy Leader, that helicopter assault coming out of a Hind, landing on the deck there of the Galaxy Leader. But in 2024, they unleashed attacks, and in 2025, they unleashed their most deadly attacks. Two sinkings, the Magic Sea and the Eternity Sea, killed 5 merchant mariners in July. Everybody thought the Houthis were done, and then all of a sudden they made this huge comeback. They have announced that they have stopped the attacks against Israeli-owned, Israeli-flagged vessels with the ceasefire. in Gaza, but the Houthi recently announced that because of the U.S. stance against Iran, that they'll start targeting U.S. ships. We just had a U.S. flag vessel, the Maersk Denver, make the transit through the region. The first ship to sail through the Gulf of Aden into the Red Sea via the Bab el Mandab, my favorite little stretch of water in the world. First time that has been done since December of 2023. And that was a significant event. Will the U.S. be able to repeat that? That's going to be an interesting question because the Houthi have announced that they are going to stop that. So if the U.S. takes actions against Iran, and it's shaping up more and more like it's not just the U.S., but many nations, Iran is a backer of the Houthis. The Houthis were receiving not just weapons, but targeting information from the Iranians. Excuse me. So we could potentially see renewed attacks in this region. The Black Sea. Since February of 2022, everybody envisioned that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was going to be quick. They were going to drive on Kyiv. You had that long attack out of Belarus into Kyiv, and the Black Sea Navy, led by the Moskva and a pretty extensive naval force, was going to blockade and shut Ukraine off from the outside world. Well, here we are 3 years later. The Ukrainians and Russians are in a repeat of World War I in the Donbass region, fighting almost akin to a trench war. And we have seen that the Black Sea have now turned into a battlefield between the Russians and Ukrainians. Ukraine this year launched a series of drone attacks using their what they call Sea Baby drones to attack ships of the Gambia registry, which were false flags. They were stateless vessels, but they were heading to Russian ports to load oil. And these attacks severely damaged several of the vessels. And it was a marked uptick in the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Not to be outdone, the Russians have targeted Ukrainian ports. They have targeted vessels in the Ukrainian ports. Actually had several merchant mariners killed by the Russians. Several Syrian crew members were killed on a vessel. And the Black Sea seems to be almost degenerating toward the tanker war that we saw in the 1980s. Let's not forget, Iran and Iraq had nearly a decade-long war that started in 1980, and over the 80s, that tanker war in the Persian Gulf escalated. And so what we saw was more and more targets against shipping. We're seeing a very similar pattern here in the Black Sea, except these attacks aren't being staged by, F-1s launching Exocet cruise missiles. Instead, what we're seeing is unmanned surface and aerial drones being used. We're seeing ballistics and cruise missiles being used. And the Black Sea is really developing into a very tough arena. The Arctic as a sea route. Last year, the Arctic, the Russians moved more trade through the Arctic, the Northern Sea route, than in any time in history. And just last month, we saw all eight of the Russian nuclear icebreakers out at sea working, keeping the Northern Sea route open. The Russians have been trying to get the Northern Sea route open and used as an alternative route for quite a while. I will say that when Ever Given got stuck in the Suez, the Russians announced, hey, the Northern Sea route was open, come use it. And unfortunately, March is like the worst time to use the Northern Sea route because of the winter. However, the Northern Sea route has seen more trade, more traffic. Over 30 million tons of dry cargo went through there. We've seen non-ice rated vessels go through there in the terms of container ships. Now, Mediterranean Shipping Company, MSC, has just reiterated their position that they're not going to use the Arctic route. Most of the major liners have announced they will not use the Arctic route. And I believe them up until it becomes profitable for them to use the Arctic route, in which case they will use the Arctic route. For Russia, this is a useful alternative. It avoids the issues of getting their ships stopped on the high seas, something we'll talk about here in a minute. It avoids choke points like the Bab el Mandab, the Suez Canal, the Straits of Gibraltar, the Straits of Malacca, the South China Sea. The only real choke point they encounter, not outside their control, is the Bering Sea, which the United States is in a very poor position to do much about. because of the withdrawal of military from that region after the end of the Cold War, and the fact that the U.S. does not have a substantial icebreaker fleet to operate in that region. They only have two medium icebreakers, the Healy, and a commercial ship reflagged into the U.S. registry this past year, the Storrs. But the U.S. did announce recently a pact with Finland and Canada to restart icebreaker construction in the United States. So we may see some icebreakers being built, along with some being built in Finland, that will be transferred over to the United States. But this region has a lot of attention. The South Koreans, for example, are investing in icebreaker construction. China is investing in icebreaker construction, and it's leading the United States to a lot of involvement in the region, not the least of which is interest in Greenland, which is a lot to do with the Arctic route, but also a lot to do with rare earth minerals and a whole host of other issues. We have Venezuela, where the U.S. has begun a process of seizing Venezuelan dark fleet vessels. 7 so far have been seized by the United States in a series of very high visibility takedowns, starting with the skipper. Most recently, we've seen a couple of vessels seized in and around the Caribbean. And then probably the one that got everyone's most attention was the Bella One, the Marinara, which was seized up between Iceland and the Faroe Islands by the United States with the assistance of Great Britain. That takedown obviously got a lot of attention, but the U.S. is using the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, a treaty it has never ratified, much like Venezuela, by the way. But they're using Article 110, Section D, where navies can board stateless vessels, or through agreements specifically with Panama to board vessels, put on board U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. military personnel, and sail those ships into U.S. ports because of arrest warrants being legislated against them in U.S. courts. The U.S. is using, maritime law as close as possible to its best abilities. It gets hindered in this by the fact that it's not it has not ratified UNCLOS. I think the U.S. would be in a much better position if it had ratified UNCLOS. I know it's a controversial position, and many people agree and disagree with that, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But it does raise it. What we have seen is this has expanded. The French just seized a vessel in the Western Mediterranean, the Grinch, that's the name of the vessel. They seized the Grinch, brought it into Marseille, basically using the same argument of the United States. Grinch was a stateless vessel. According to the French, Marine Nationale did the boarding. They certified that the vessel was operating without proper registry. The ship has since been sailed into Marseille. And the fear here is that more dark fleet vessels will be targeted. The prospect for 2026 is we can see more of these done. This is going to raise the issue about these flags of conveniences and whether or not that there is proper registries being done for these vessels. Marinara, for example, announced that it had reflagged to the Russian registry. However, the U.S. argument is that since the ship was improperly registered to begin with, you can't flip registries at sea. You would need to do inspections, you would need to do certifications to ensure you're meeting the requirements of SOLAS and MARPOL and all the other requirements. Basically, you would need a full classification, port state control inspection before you could operate the vessel and do a true flip of the registry. So Venezuela really sits out there as a major player here. Next, we have South China Sea. The Chinese and the Philippines fighting over EEZs, exclusive economic zones in that region. This past year, we had a very visible confrontation between the Chinese and the Philippines that led to a collision, not between the Chinese and the Philippines, but between a Chinese Coast Guard cutter and a Chinese naval vessel that damaged the Chinese frigate, the Coast Guard cutter, it damaged a Chinese destroyer and potentially killed several crew members. We really don't have official word from China, the casualties involved in this, But this confrontation out there has led to the United States doing military drills with the Philippines, assigning vessels down in that region. Definitely, it raises some very vocal potential for a confrontation between China and the Philippines in this region. One of the big fears is that not a confrontation between the US and China, but China and one of its neighbors. I would argue that one of the things that the Chinese has structured their Navy, the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army's Navy, is really not so much to go toe to toe against the US Navy, but to deal with nations like the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, that would try to interdict or halt the flow of Chinese shipping through the region. It's one of the reasons that the Chinese are investing so much in redundant sea lines of communications and sources for their materiel. They're investing in shipping out into the South Pacific. Why the South Pacific? Well, you can go around Australia. You can go across to a new superport in Peru to offload. You can go through the Drake Passage, Straits of Magellan, or you could use the Arctic Sea route. That South China Sea is the jugular of Chinese trade. And one of the things they're trying to do is build up some redundancy in their ability to move goods in the area. Then we have a large naval presence building up in the Indian Ocean, and again, we've seen this repeatedly throughout this time period. We saw it with a large naval buildup in the Caribbean prior to the interdiction of Venezuela. Now we're seeing one here in the Indian Ocean. Do we see targeting of Iranian vessels coming out? Do we start seeing takedowns of Iranian ships? Do we see a strike against Iran because of the protests taking place in Iran? Obviously, Iran, major shipper out there in the world. NITC is a large shipping firm involved in shipment of oil out there. We've seen sanctions being expanded against not just Iran, Venezuela, and Russia, but targeting of specific ships, even ships' captains and individuals associated with that. So the sanction regime is doing a lot to drive ships and entities over into this dark fleet. And we're really seeing the potential for a confrontation between those. And I think it's something to definitely be watching as we go forward. The fourth topic has to be the net zero framework. So if I was a betting man on Monday in October when the IMO got together in London, whether or not the net zero framework was going to be implemented, I would have been betting yes. I would have had money down on that. The fact that by the end of the week it was tabled for a year was absolutely jaw-dropping. And this is not a commentary whether I'm pro or against the net zero framework. I'm apolitical on almost every issue I ever talk about. But I was shocked that the Trump administration was able to garner the support that it did. Saudi Arabia, UAE. This is right after the peace accord was brokered between Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas in Gaza. So there was a lot of clout that the Trump administration had. There were a lot of issues with net zero that a lot of nations quietly had wanting to voice. Obviously, the net zero framework was absolutely essential for passage because one of the things that net zero framework was going to ensure was the need for alternative fuels so that companies that had begun that shift over to secondary fuels, whether it was liquefied natural gas, ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, you name it, whatever it was, the flavor of the day in terms of alternative fuels. What net zero was going to do in October of 2025 was tell the suppliers that, yes, there is going to be a demand and you need to build that infrastructure in place to fill these vessels up. A year delay does put some questions about this. Now, Lloyd's List came out with their, prospective for 2026, and their perspective is that net zero gets passed this year, and it goes on. I am not as confident in that. I think this kind of ripped the Band-Aid off the issue of net zero, and there's a lot of issues at play here about, who funds this, where's this going to, who's paying for this, and whether or not we are rapidly heading to this. I've talked a lot about the fact that there are a lot of backers of net zero, and one of the things this does is it helps shipbuilding because ships are going to have to be updated. You're going to have to replace ships at a much faster rate than are factored for in the past. I think that there's a lot of issues associated with net zero. And one of the things that the Trump administration has done is shine a light on shipping in a way that it really has not in the past. And I think other nations were looking for some coverage to talk about this. So I think watching what happens in the International Maritime Organization in these discussions in 2026 is going to be absolutely essential. I think there's going to be a huge amount of discussion associated about what happens as we go forward. The fifth topic, and again, there's a lot about the IMO we can go into here. I'm just focusing on the net zero framework. I think IMO needs to step up on multiple issues. I am a harsh critic of the IMO and many times, but the IMO is the entity that's out there regulating and legislating things regarding international shipping. I think there needs to be more transparency in ownership of ships, in who insuring these vessels, in the proper documentation and classification of vessels. The fact that the dark fleet can even operate is an issue that needs to be taken up by the IMO alongside carbon emissions, pollution, and everything. Let's not forget, things like SOLAS and MARPOL were absolutely essential for cleaning up the maritime industry, for getting us a maritime industry that by far is much safer, much cleaner than it was decades ago. I highlight a lot of ship accidents on my channel, but in truth, I tell people all the time, yes, you may know more about ship accidents today because of my channel and news outlets around the world. But in truth, shipping is much safer and much more balanced than it has been in the past. But what we are seeing and what is happening here is issues regarding basically whether or not shipping is having higher impact problems as we go. All right. Our fifth topic here that we are discussing and talking about has to deal with insurance. If you ask me, the one thing I have learned over 5 years of hosting a YouTube channel about shipping, I would probably say it has to do with insurance. I probably have learned more about insurance than any other topic out there. And I will always tell people that if you want to understand global shipping, you have to understand insurance. It is literally the heart and soul of understanding shipping. At the same time, I will say this, and I apologize for anybody in the insurance industry out there. Man, it's hard to get people excited about insurance. It really is. It is a tough one, but you have to be able to put it in the context. So when you have an event like Dolly take place, catastrophic event, one of the biggest stories I tracked this year was the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board hearing on the Dolly. Everybody was like, really, one loose wire caused this? Yes. That is, it wasn't just a single loose wire, but it was the Swiss cheese holes lining up to allow the progression of events that led you to the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, the death of 6 road workers on the bridge. But insurance is absolutely essential. I think Lloyd's just did a story, maybe been today or yesterday, where they're talking about that we're looking at the max payout from the P&I Club of $3.1 billion in insurance, for this event. And what gets me is if Dolly was one of those dark fleet vessels, which had no insurance or shaky insurance or no reinsurance, well, then the state of Maryland, the city of Baltimore would have been on the hook to pay for all of this. And I think insurance is literally one of the biggest markets that we're seeing it. We're seeing it with the evolution of war risk insurance. I've had many discussions. I've been asked to sit in on meetings and discussions with U.S. military, U.S. government officials. We've talked about the Houthi in the Red Sea, and one of the things I always talk about with the Houthi in the Red Sea is that the Houthi in the Red Sea are not very effective. I mean, when you look at them, it's been almost 2 years with the Houthi in the Red Sea. They have attacked a grand total of about 150 ships. They have sunk four, and they've killed nine merchant mariners, and maybe a dozen ships damaged, or 24 tops. That's not a lot. But what the Houthis have done is caused the insurance to go up. They've caused war risk to kick in, additional protection kick in. That's what causes diversions. It's what leads Maersk Lines and Hapag in December of 2023 to announce they're going around they're going around the Cape. It's also what's keeping ships from returning back to that region, is the potential of paying that insurance. And so understanding the insurance market is absolutely key out there. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing is the increase in premiums on ships. The cost to insure ships is increasing across the board. It's becoming much more expensive out there. And it's not just accidents like the Dolly, it's fires on board ships. We're seeing the outbreak of many more fires. I am doing a video right now on the motor vessel ONE Henry Hudson. That fire was caused by retroing, taking back lithium ion batteries in containers back to Asia. The official report hasn't come out, but I've seen the images, I've seen the pictures, and I have seen I've seen the basically the evidence from people on the ground there, which I can't release, but I know what it is. And what we've seen is the outbreak of that on container ships at sea. We had a Maersk ship this year off the west coast of Africa have a fire on board. We had a very visible fire on board a ship, a car carrier just south of the Aleutians in the Pacific that sank because of this. We are definitely seeing insurance playing a much larger role than ever before. All right, that takes me to the last part here, and then I'm going to open it up for questions, is what's going on with shipping in the future. There's a moment in all of our lives where we reach the point that we're no longer Marty McFly, but now we're Doc Brown, and I've reached that point. I've realized now I am not the Marty McFly I thought I was. But the problem with predicting the future is there's too many issues out there. It's really tough. I joked when I started my YouTube channel that there's never going to be enough for me to talk about regarding shipping. This is going to be a little bit of a hobby of mine, a lark. I'm going to post a video maybe once a week, excuse me, talking about shipping. But there is never going to be enough going on out there for me to talk about. And what I can say is basically that is not true. I mean, there is more happening in shipping on a daily basis. I am a one-person show, and I just cannot cover everything that is out there. And what I can say about the future, what I've learned doing this since 2021, is that it is very hard to predict what's going to happen in the future with shipping. Excuse me. Because there are so many variables out there. I listed a whole batch of them out there for you right now. We could have President Trump reinitiate tariffs. We have geopolitical consternation out there. We can have an accident. Let's not forget, the Dolly shutting the port of Baltimore. Baltimore is the 11th, 12th largest port in the United States. If that happens coming out of Houston, if that happens coming out of Savannah or out of New York, New Jersey, or out of LA and Long Beach, it's catastrophic. It is catastrophic what that could do. If a ship goes sideways coming out of Port Hedland, Australia, and that shuts off 5% of global trade, catastrophic, absolutely catastrophic event could happen. And one of the things I think that has become crystal clear in watching what happens with shipping is that shippers and carriers are building more versatility into their systems. When one of the things that happened with the global supply chain crisis was nobody had a backup. Everybody was used to taking their cargo from East Asia, dumping it into LA and Long Beach, and going through that system. That doesn't. There are backups to that. If you're a carrier, you should be thinking about moving goods in multiple sources. We've seen the alliance system that has been the bedrock of shipping break apart in a way, with the 2M alliance giving way to MSC, Mediterranean Shipping being the behemoth carrier of all times. We have seen the birth of Gemini come in. We just saw MSC getting into the tanker business with the Aponte family buying VLCCs. We're seeing consolidation in the LNG market right now. Global bulk trade is through the roof in terms of trade. China just made a huge deal with Brazil about the export of soybeans. We're definitely seeing everything moving at a ludicrous speed when it comes to shipping. And unfortunately, many of us are just trying to stay afloat and see what's happening. The day to day really doesn't allow a lot in the shipping business to really predict what's going to happen in the future and to put in the mechanisms that allow us to be prepared to deal with issues when they hit us. All right, I got myself at 12:45. I'm going to hold it right here, turn myself back over to Joel, and see if there's any questions I can address here. I want to thank everybody for the opportunity, and hopefully I haven't bored you to tears.
Wow, what a great presentation. Dr. Sal talked about shipbuilding and the effects of tariffs and choke points and net zero framework and insurance. And we took a trip around the world, around the maritime world that was packed with facts and analysis. All I can say is I am glad I'm not one of your students and had to take notes during your presentations to your classes. Well, Dr. Sal, we've got several questions for you. All of them are good. I want to bring one up first that's kind of interesting. Uh, this is an anonymous attendee that says, with respect to the Marinera, can you cite the legal authority that requires a vessel that changes flag registry to first undergo a PSC inspection before that change of flag is recognized or valid? You mentioned that your understanding of the Coast Guard's rationale for disregarding Russians' confirmation that the Marinera was flagged in their registry when approached by the Coast Guard before boarding. Any clarification appreciated to the extent possible. Thank you for a great presentation.
Sure. So UNCLAW's article, and I apologize here. It's either Article 92 or 94. I try to remember every 200 articles of UNCLAW's off the top of my head, but it's either 92, 94 that talks about re-registry of vessels. And one of the things that it specifies is that re-registry typically doesn't happen during a voyage, but it has to show a change of ownership. And for Russian ownership specifically, Russia has to own the vessel. There has to be a company that specifically owns the vessel. But as we all know, maritime law is something that has been around, for millennia. It is not quite as written in stone. I use the analogy that UNCLAW's the 1982 treaty is 200 pages long. The Code of Federal Regulations for the United States is 193,000 pages. So, I mean, there's not every ability in here. So, what the argument the Coast Guard is making and the U.S. is making, and I've talked to people in the U.S. government about this. One of my great things about having a YouTube channel is everybody wants to talk to you. It's great. I get lots of information from people. Is that they're making that argument that the ship was not legally registered to begin with. It was under a stateless vessel, and that to do a proper re-registration of a vessel, a ship has to meet all the requirements of a classification society, of insurance. It has to meet everything sufficient for a port state control. That is the argument that the U.S. is making. Now, to make that argument, the U.S. has to pull that ship into port, and Marinara is sitting right now in Scotland, where the ship is technically under the UK jurisdiction, and the owner of the vessel can make a petition to a UK court right now to petition whether or not that is legal. That's the thing. You have to bring it within jurisdictional waters of a country. The U.S. is trying to get the ship out of Scotland, get it over to U.S. waters, so the adjudication can be done in U.S. waters. I will argue that maritime law is always nebulous. It's always going to be clouded in this. You can make the argument that the U.S. Act is illegal because the U.S. has not signed UNCLAWS, and therefore it's operating under the old 58 treaty, which has been basically been voided by the 82 treaty. So again, what this needs to be adjudicated. But again, I would argue that the ship was originally under a false flag. It was flying a Guyana flag, and it was never properly registered in Guyana. At least according to Guyana, it hasn't been. And I don't think you can just, Lords of War this and just change the name of the vessel and drape a flag over it and do it. I think they threw a Russian flag over it because they were hoping that was going to scare the U.S. off. And what they found out is that that did not work. So I should know too, I am not an admiralty lawyer. I am not a lawyer. I'm married to a lawyer, which is great, but I am not an admiralty lawyer. So.
Thank you. That was a great answer to that question. Thanks very much. I got another question here from one of our members, Mark Wiggins from the Port of Miami. And of course, it relates to the Propeller Club and the maritime industry. So I'm selfishly posting his question here. He says, "Hi, Sal. Thank you for your time and work supporting the industry and providing us with nonpartisan content. It's a fresh feeling to have industry first content without divisive language in today's age. My question for you is, what issue in the industry has the highest return on investment for Propeller Club chapters to tackle this year? Could it be supporting our clubs with shipyard members? Could it be lobbying our local House and Senate representatives?"
First off, Mark, I appreciate that, and hats off to you in the Port of Miami. I love looking at ports, that don't get all the attention in the world. They're big ports that get it. I think Port Miami does a great job, and I just weathered an ice storm, and I'm up for half a foot of snow. So if you need me to come to Miami and give a talk, I'm happy to do that in the next week or so to get me out of here. But I will say this. I think what propeller clubs and local propeller clubs need to do more than anything else for the biggest bang on the buck is to do some education for local and federal employees. I think that is something, and for business leaders too. I will add that too. Many years ago, as a history student, I was a part of a fellowship that went up to West Point, where the fellowship at West Point was to teach people not military history, but to teach them how to teach military history. And I thought that was a great immersive event where I got to meet people from the field and really do it. I think we need to do that on a very similar basis. How many people in and around Miami don't know what the Port of Miami does? I would argue a great majority of them, including your local representatives in around there on both the state house and Senate, county leaders, and community leaders. I would throw in educators into the area too, your local community colleges, high school guidance counselors in the area. I think outreach is so essential in everything. I joke, I'm a volunteer firefighter. I was talking about this just before. Every time I go on a call as a volunteer firefighter, if there's a little kid there, we give them a coloring book, we give them a firefighter's hat, and years later, they show up at my fire station. They want to be firefighters. It's great. It's great outreach. That's what you need to do. I think you get the most bang for your buck by hitting the government leaders right now. Host a seminar, bring it on for continuing education, talk about what the port entails, what it does, show them the port. Unfortunately, you're behind a gated fence that no one gets a chance to see. And then bring it out into the communities. There is more you can do with social media today than ever before. Get those videos of what it's like to work in the Port of Miami. What's an ILA worker like in the Port of Miami? What are business opportunities in the Port of Miami? That's what I would be focusing on all the time.
Great. Okay, Jeff Prosser has asked this. With the recent uptick of entry-level mariners and the lack of opportunities for those mariners lacking, such as military sea lift command, putting a stop on entry-level hiring and few contracts available in unions like the SIU, what would you see happening as far as manning offsets to keep people in the industry?
No, I've been very critical of the, shipbuilding in the United States. I've come out, and one of the things that I was very critical about is shipbuilding doesn't get you a ship for 3 to 5 years. I mean, that's a long prospect. We're not going to see anything. We had this idea about reflagging ships into the U.S. industry. We brought in the CMA CGM Phoenix. Crowley just brought in the American Energy, a LNG carrier. I think we need to have a very serious discussion about what we can do in the short term to bring ships into the U.S. registry as quickly as possible. Protecting them to sail through the Red Sea, for example, offsets to offset the higher operating costs for U.S. flag vessels and U.S. crews. We need to do that because, again, what you want to do is get people immediately into the industry as quick as possible because you need a short-term, medium-term, long-term solution. Shipbuilding is long-term. You're not going to see those ships for many years. We need to get the industry up and running. So SIU, which had never in the past had to advertise, went out and advertised. They went out, they had to go out and do something they had never done before. And what they did is they got people in. But now what their problem is, a lot of shipping companies are cutting those bottom line entry level jobs. Same thing with military sea lift command, cutting those bottom line entry jobs. There are three masters, I think, at military sea lift command who started off as basically ordinary seamen. They came in, literally worked their way up through the hawse pipe. That is a great career selling point to young men and women getting into the field. We need to do more for that. We need to do everything we can. There needs to be a discussion with the Maritime Administration, Steve Carmel coming in as the Maritime Administrator, with the new commander, Ben Nicholson, over at Military Sea Lift Command. We need to open up those entry-level jobs. We need to get them up there. We need to be talking with the SIU, the shipping unions. We need to be talking with the ILA, the ILWU about these so that we can get the enticement in for these young people to come in. And again, I think there are opportunities out there. A lot of the shipping firms have opportunities. A lot of the transportation systems in and around the ports have opportunities. We just need people to understand that they are out there. So I agree with you.
Okay, we might have time for two more, but I'll do this one from Chandler Thornton, who is a Tulane law student. In your view, with respect to the future of autonomous vessels, what are the greatest challenges facing maritime stakeholders, including vessel owners and operators, marine insurance providers, Coast Guard authorities, and others?
So I think the U.S. has got to look at certain things that are going to propel it ahead. And I think one of those areas is autonomy. It may be an area that the U.S. can go ahead. We've had issues with manning levels by the Coast Guard and by unions, obviously, in the past. Autonomy is really interesting. I am one of those people who will tell you I don't ever foresee a 24,000 TEU autonomous vessel because you're never going to be able to insure it. I mean, no one is going to insure that vessel, send it out to sea, and hope it arrives at the other side. I just don't think it happens. I think what we do see is reduced crewing levels on ships, particularly international vessels, foreign flag vessels. That is something I think we start seeing more and more when it comes to autonomy. The other thing I think that's really important to start talking about is to include autonomy into certain vessel operations that right now are basically handled the way we handled them 50 years ago. You know, physically, people hand on steering wheels or handles steering vessels. Where's the autonomy? We had the grounding of Everforward out of Baltimore a few years ago. That was because the pilot was distracted and the third mate didn't, say anything. There should have been some sort of autonomous issue in here that says, okay, we're going to turn. Unless you don't want me to turn, I'm going to turn so that I stay in the channel. There are ways we can bring autonomy in it. The Navy is looking at autonomy quite a bit. And I think that's going to be an issue that comes in. But there are the issues of legislation and importance about it. Who is responsible for a lawsuit should you have a fully autonomous vessel out there? I think the U.S. needs to embrace technology. I think where you look historically at the past, where the U.S. jumps ahead is through technical innovations, whether it's the Baltimore schooner, it's the Clipper ship, it's the introduction in right after World War I of a shipbuilding program that uses oil as a fuel that challenges British dominance on the high seas because they need coaling stations. We didn't. That challenges them. It's the introduction of containerization. It's the super tanker. It's Ted Aronson and the modern cruise liner. All those are American innovations. They all come up. The question is, can we capitalize on them? And I think autonomy is one of those ones we need to look at. We're seeing AI right now being used in cargo management and cargo loads that we haven't seen in the past. We really need to kind of get ahead. And I think where we're going to see this is outside the shipping industry. Remember, the guy who revolutionized shipping industry more than anything else was a truck driver named Malcolm McLean when he comes up with the Ideal X. Well, Elon Musk takes SpaceX and revolutionizes space travel. We need somebody to kind of take a look at shipping and what's the next step.
Try to squeeze one last question in here, Dr. Sal. What do you, and this is not something that lends itself to an easy answer, or a short answer, but what do you see as the biggest disconnect between regulators and industry?
I think the the biggest disconnect is kind of I mean we see it all the time. I mean if you do anything hands on, you sit there and curse an engineer. It's like who built this? It's like who did not have this idea? And one of the things I think we don't do is really we stovepipe our industry greatly. I mean, everyone gets into their sector and that's it. My life. My life is this sector and this is it. I always argue I'm a graduate of SUNY Maritime College. I did not understand the shipping industry I went into. I understood how to navigate a ship. I could do it great. I understood how to drive a ship, how to navigate it, how to do everything with it. I didn't understand the operation of the shipping line I was working with or the industry I was going into. I think we need to, pull the veil off and talk about things macro. I get a lot of criticism sometimes. Oh, Sal, you're talking too general. You're talking 50,000 foot. Yeah, I am. I'm talking very general to bring a broader audience in, but at times I'll, micro down to the granular level and talk about things that would typically lose people's discussion. I think we need to do a bigger issue about talking about shipping as that. Who represents shipping in the United States? Where are those advocacy groups like the Propeller Club? It's very important. The Propeller Club, I joke, I was talking to Joel earlier about this when we were talking about setting this up. I went back and looked at the International Propeller Club's writings from, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. They had a national following. I mean, was a huge industry that had a lot of following. We need to get that back again. Unfortunately, when you talk about shipping in the United States right now, it tends to focus on Navy. That seems to be the focus. And we create organizations and conferences that kind of tailor to our unique need, but we're not doing it. It's why when we were talking about what the Miami chapter can do, so I think it's so important to pull in people outside the industry and do that navigation. One of the things, the last thing I'll end on this, Joel, is when I was writing my doctoral dissertation, I remember writing it, and I was writing about the interaction between commercial shipping and national defense. And my doctoral dissertation advisor told me something. He goes, "I'm going to tell you something I never tell doctoral students is you got to broaden your view out because nobody understands what you're writing about because you are so narrowed focus that nobody understands the broader context. You've got to, reach out a little bit further." And that's kind of been my mantra is really kind of talk out, explain things in a way. I just did a video on the Federal Maritime Commission. That is not an exciting topic. That is not, the Federal Maritime Commission, and I apologize to anyone from the FMC who's watching. It's not an exciting topic. But when you talk about what the Federal Maritime Commission actually does and their range and their scope, all of a sudden somebody goes, how did I not know that this organization not only exists, but has existed for many years? And in many ways, it's much like the Propeller Club and what they do since 1927.
Thanks, Dr. Sal. Just on your last comment there, I'm going to go watch that YouTube video because our new leadership with the Propeller Club that was elected last October, we're going to be coming to Washington in February to go visit the FMC and many of the other Coast Guard, RAD, several others. So we'll get a little bit of knowledge before we go and see them anyway.
I got a note from many commissioners of the FMC about my video, so it was very funny. So.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Sal. This was an absolutely fantastic webinar for the first one of this year. I hope we can replicate them with as many other good ones like this. For those of you who enjoyed this today, please check out his YouTube show, What's Going On with Shipping, and from the International Propeller Club. We thank you very much for attending, and we'll be advertising our February webinar soon. Thank you, Dr. Sal.
Thank you, Joel, for the invite. It was a pleasure to talk to you guys today.
Thank you.